So first of all, I would like to introduce you. Everyone in auditorium already knows, but with whom we are talking. So UTA POTTGIESSER, she's a Docomomo chair and a professor at Delft University. AIDEEN Berry, she's an artist, Irish-based artist, but works in Kaunas and did an incredible movie on Kaunas modernism. So it's actually a pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to have such a company and to have an opportunity to ask questions. Before passing the opportunity to auditorium, probably I should start with some questions, which is really important for me. And since the last presentation was probably the most fresh, so I would start with a question to Jorge. And actually, by inviting you, and I think that I have this question probably for 5 or maybe more years, and most probably I'm asking as academician for academician about the concept of heritage. And I have a feeling that the 21st century brings a challenge to the field of cultural heritage preservation, and we should rethink discipline. What is your opinion? Where is moving the discipline of cultural heritage preservation?
Very big question, but I would say that one of the really big changes is that we are looking more closely at the way that what a building is. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn down because I'm hearing an echo, so I'm just going to try to turn my. Can you still hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I would say that we are so used to thinking about heritage as sitting in one place, but in fact, a heritage is the way that we've come to realize that heritage is actually not only in one place, but is moving with us. And we are looking at the environmental impact that our civilization is having. And so we are trying to make sense of that world. And part of that has led us to really rethink the notion of the stable monument and the idea that that the monument is all in one place. All of our laws and heritage are based on the idea of property, which is based on the idea of the subdivision of land. So they're all really tied up in the notion of thinking about heritage from the ground up as a form of property and as a form of individual property that can be expropriated by the state. I think that what I'm trying to propose here through some of this work is that we need to rethink that notion that heritage is bound up with a notion of property and try to free it up, because the whole idea of heritage really at its core is the notion of a shared object. And so really trying to push on that, we can begin to think about other kinds of heritage that are already shared, like the air, and to begin to think of heritage from the sky down rather than from the ground up. And it begins to really raise all sorts of questions about where does heritage end? What are the limits of it? But also, how do we take care of it? Because I think that for me, art is a way of caring for the world. It's an act of care. Heritage is an act of care. So, the objects that we choose together are ways of expressing our care. And one of the other big changes that has happened in the field that I think we're acknowledging is that the choice of what heritage is not limited to expert opinion, but actually is more of a dialogue with a broad community, and that these communities take shape around these objects. And these objects are sometimes I would like to call them quasi-objects, because they're not really objects, they are quasi-objects. And they become objects in the interaction with the community. And so paying attention to how communities are forming around these materials is very important, I think. And so pollution can be one of those materials, but also material flows. And I think this is part of how we think about modernism. Maybe we could we could go on, but I think this may be just a way to start our conversation.
Actually, it's a really good start, and while seeing our context, I really would like to put the concept of taking care. I think it's really crucially important when we're talking about interpreting and about role of the artist. And fortunately, we have AIDEEN with us, and she just gave us a very nice presentation on the process of making movie, and we were discussing about how much human effort it was invested in this process. And I guess that the taking care is probably one of the most important subject, like ideas which we could attach to this. And I would like to continue with a question to AIDEEN, and maybe adding one more layer to this concept of how we care about the heritage, about the role of the artist in the process of education. Because somehow I had a feeling, and by the way, it's a spontaneous question, I prepared another one, but after seeing your presentation for me, I saw that the process of making movies is a process of giving a lecture on modernism. So could you comment a little bit about this aspect of education?
It was really interesting following Jorge's really excellent presentation there. I started thinking about Schrödinger. And Schrödinger escaped Nazi oppression around the same time as what was happening here in Kaunas in 1939. He ended up in Dublin and he started teaching physics in UCD. And he started thinking about molecular transference. And he talked about the objects that we are closest to. On a molecular level, we are swapping our molecules with them and they with us in exactly the same way that Jorge has been talking about dust and our relationship with dust and the buildings. And when I started working with the people here in Kaunas, I realized that on a molecular level, they are the architecture, they are the heritage, and it's about how you bring that out of your DNA and how you democratize the artistic production process to make sure that they feel that their voice is heard and that they are enfranchised to be part of that creative process. And that's kind of quite authentic. Their authenticity, their relationship with the architecture is really key. And I mean, maybe it's a pedagogical thing, but also I think it's a respect thing. It's about like how you're respecting that lived experience of your collaborator, I think. So, yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Yes, actually, I think that we have more and more arguments on diversity of approaches towards heritage. And now I would like to move to with the question to Uta as a representative of Docomomo, first of all. And again, probably with really similar question, I gave it to Jorge about the concept of heritage preservation, and in organizations which we consider as traditional, but maybe it's not necessary, maybe everything is changing. So what is the role of, let's say, artistic interpretation, this kind of education in Docomomo organization and all around the globe? What would be your opinion?
Yes, yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, I have so many things in mind I would like to say. So maybe just very first respond to the quote, VAIDAS, you were putting forward in the beginning, saying that buildings don't talk. I guess we have seen that they talk, I mean, in different ways, visually, but also through the people, as we saw in AIDEEN's contribution, and through the dust, as Jorge has demonstrated. So in that way, I think we see that there, what kind of different layers could be unraveled somehow through these artistic interventions, and I guess there are many more. And well, also coming back to this first question you ask Jorge, like on what is the status of heritage in a way. I think we are in the middle of a paradigm shift anyway, because I think this idea of tangible and immovable heritage and intangible is becomes more and more obvious also through heritage studies, which are, I mean, different from, let's say, this original restoration, conservation and historical approach, which got a much broader approaches through social sciences to cross the disciplines. So I think we are very much moving forward in that sense, and in an academic level for sure. What is still missing, and you addressed also institutions, traditional institutions, and of course it's true. I mean, society or countries or nation states are of course still organized through institutions, like there is a conservation department, and of course still any kind of heritage administrations are still seen as very conservative in the sense of protecting something in a status. So they are still, I would say in the majority, seen as a kind of threat towards new developments by the architects on one hand, even seen as a threat maybe by developers, because they hinder. But we have to say, I mean, the amount of listed heritage is very little. Actually, I don't know statistics, but it's in between 1% or 4%, depending on the country. So it's just a very minimal part. And I think we as an institution like DOCOMOMO, what we like to emphasize is it's not about the very few listed buildings or monuments, but heritage is really, we always call it the ordinary. I mean, the everyday's building, and I think that is what we saw in the movies of AIDEEN very much. So every building counts because it's part of the collective memory. And I was also addressing the multiple modernities. I learned that apparently is a new term for DOCOMOMO, but I must say, I think for me it's a very central term as a global institution. And what we noticed when we are talking with our different working parties, that they all approach it very differently. So we have these activists. It really depends on the most pressing questions a country has. So what is in threat? What is the political situation? And this also then defines the way they are acting. And we have the academic approach. We also have practitioners that really do the physical work on buildings. So in that sense, yes, multiple modernities, multiple approaches, and I really think that the world in general is opening up to this understanding that everything we have is part of our history and is important. Maybe I stop here.
Thank you, Uta. And I think now it's time for the questions from auditorium. If we have some. Do we have? I'm not so sure the lights. Yes, please. Lolita. Probably I will give you. Yeah.
Hello, it's a question to Jorge. I'm Lolita Jablonski, and I'm the Chief Curator of the National Gallery of Art in Vilnius. So I'm speaking here both as a museum person, somehow related to preservation of various stuff, and also as a curator for contemporary art. Just out of curiosity, what kind of future do you project for your artworks? Do you imagine they have to be preserved in the museum, or do you wish them to be somehow otherwise preserved, or they have to be destroyed? Could you give a comment on that?
Thank you for the question. Well, see, I think my artworks really raise questions about what museums are. And that's, and that for me is the more interesting, let's say, problem. Certainly, depending on my artwork, they might have a materiality that is more or less, let's say, durable. But I think that what the question for me is really, you know, there is a continuum of care of our environment that museums are involved in, and that it is in a continuum with the care of cities and with the care of, you know, from objects to large environments. So museums occupy a small area on the continuum of care that has to do with objects. And they are a 19th century invention, museums. And I think they made a lot of sense when we needed to preserve the spoils of war. Like when, you know, Napoleon went about its, you know, conquering of different places in Europe, he sent all the stuff to the Louvre, right? And you still have Veronese's wedding at Cana that should be sent back to Venice, but it's still in Paris. The museum was made to care for a certain size of object, for a certain idea of what culture is. When we started thinking about how do we preserve cities, we created bureaucracies at the municipal level to try to care for cities. I think what my works are trying to do is to both inhabit all of those spaces and try to create connections among the different kinds of areas of our, you know, our practices of care that are in trying to link them up, you know, because how do we care for the air, for example? You know, let's say a museum could be a place to try to think about the air around it and to try to produce a kind of care practice for the air around it and not just the air inside of it. So I didn't show you this project, but I did a project for the museum in Cornell University where I tried to think of the museum as a place to see the air outside of the museum. And this is a kind of ongoing series of works that I'm very interested in to try to have the museum become an activist role. And I think that museums are changing, and the more interesting museums are actually trying to expand their care practices, involve communities, and think about the way that they can actually have a role outside, but not just, let's say, to take over what a municipality does, but to push that municipality, because the museums also have a tremendous flexibility to create advocacy works, to engage communities in a different way. And so, you know, that is for me what these dust pieces begin to do. They are, you know, they are ephemeral in some way, but every work inside a museum is ephemeral. You know, when you look at a Renaissance painting, you're really looking at 20th century paint for the most part. They're highly restored. But we like to think of these Renaissance paintings as Renaissance objects, but they're really composite. So I'm very interested in that act of care as an act of regeneration of art. And I think that that can be brought to regenerating other areas of our world that really need that regeneration, like our environment, like the air. And these are the shared objects we need to, you know, begin to think about as we bring along all the objects that we also find and need to make meaning out of our culture, which are inside museums. So I hope that that addresses the question in regards to the care of the objects and their temporality.
Thank you, Jorge. Other questions? The light is on my eyes, I can see, but probably not. If you will have, please tell it loud. And I would like to continue with this question of taking care and by making meanings, by giving meanings, and address again a question to AIDEEN about your film, of course, but also generally as attitude of the artist when you work with cultural heritage. Where is, let's say, the balance between, I would say, three important aspects is what we know about object in the textbook, about the experiences of local people who inhabit, who well, know the place, and they have personal ideas on the object, and the artist's role. So how you find the balance between these three, and which of these is more important, if it's possible to say so?
I mean, I'm kind of interested in how the canon is incorrect. I'm kind of interested in how art history is not representation of truth a lot of the time, and that's where people come in, because they give you the othered voice. They give you the voice that wasn't present, that's not in the museums, or that has been marginalized. So I think the role of the artist is, in a way, it's almost like a bridge through hierarchies into different classes or other maligned or othered voices, and trying to, I suppose, maybe like extend the ladder or share the platform a bit around the discussion about what constitutes heritage or what constitutes the art object. So that's kind of what I see my role in, is a bit of that, actually, is more reaching out to find out those hidden stories that aren't represented. Or like it was really interesting that Jorge talked about like the root of the idea of the museum. It's rooted in this idea of the Palace of Victory, and yet a lot of it's really contentious. A lot of museums, like the British Museum, really needs to repatriate a lot of its collection to the people that it stole its items from. So history is not always accurate, and actually people give you a different prism to view history from, and that's where I kind of see my role in that way, is like giving them the power to have that prism and conducting that investigation.
Yes, I guess it's a lot of ways of talking about past, and not necessarily each way is exactly cultural heritage preservation in a classical sense. I would like to move to Uta with probably a bit broader question on a global scale, because such an organization as Docomomo have such a view. What is the situation right now, like towards attitude to modern movements? Is it like increasing with such activities as we do in CONAS, or maybe everyone is maybe the interest is declines, and we tend to think about past more from artistic perspective, not from cultural heritage perspective? What would be your opinion?
I think the view on modern heritage is very broad, and it also depends on which country we are looking at. And I know that actually Docomomo had a discussion, I think, I'm not sure, about maybe already 20 years ago, that they said, oh, but we have raised awareness now, and maybe we could just, finish our work. And actually, it were, I think, in particular, the Brazilians, so the South American countries, I think the Asian countries only joined later, who said, no way, because this, having Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa and others, they said, no, we still need that, because we are not that far, and everything is under threat. So I would want to say we are living in different time zones, not just on the globe, but also in ways of perception. And for me, it's very interesting, for example, that we just had a lot of Middle East countries joining Docomomo in the last 5 years. And we are now also dealing with the United Arab Emirates maybe to join. And there, the building started in the mid-70s and 70s. But they consider, and these are the official institutions, not only them, but the official institutions, they consider that as a heritage, as a legacy they have to take care. And of course, in a country that has such a real estate development that is rapidly, destroying a lot of buildings. So that was, I think, and I see on the other side also in Asia, we have a lot of groups that are really approaching it on a very activist level. that are organizing, I think this idea of city walks, heritage walks is quite famous. Also in the Eastern European countries, we have a lot of groups of young people that organize exhibitions. I think a bit similar approach maybe that we could see here in Kaunas. And I would like to make one comment to the museums discussion. I really also think that museums are rather act like a catalyst, because we cannot store everything in the museum. And as you say, Jorge said, well, the air is actually something we should protect. So the cities are there. I mean, and so we cannot put them into a museum. Well, we could put the Buckminster Fuller idea of putting a kind of glass dome across our cities is also not, it's a nice vision. And maybe it could still serve as an image to how we could really conserve the entity of this development. Yeah, and I think, as I said, I think we're in the middle of this paradigm shift, but which has actually come with the threat that we have through climate change and also resource scarcity. So what we see in the younger generations, like with Fridays for Future, it's of course triggered maybe from another aspect. It's just like saying we don't have material, we cannot just continue growing, so we have to be much more careful or we have to value what we have in a different way. So I think this is very much contributing to that development.
Thank you. Yes, I guess I will bring with myself this concept of taking care and valuing in very different possible ways. And so thank you so much for contributing for the discussion, and thank you, Jorge, for being with us. And it was a pleasure to see you. Nevertheless, it's online. And right now, I just want to remind you that we will have a lunch break, and after the lunch break, we will continue with more topics which suggest another ways of interpreting and challenging the concepts of heritage. We'll talk about subjectivity, Anthropocene. We'll talk about difficult heritage. So please do have a good rest and be prepared for the second part, and be sharply 2:00 p.m. in our auditorium. So see you soon.